Hi, Pauline. I read that your page, your Instagram page, which I accidentally came across and I absolutely resonated with, is a love letter to fellow children of immigrants, which I found the best way to describe what I saw. What is this all about? What do you do?
So I am a psychologist and I'm a daughter of immigrants, really an immigrant myself. I moved from Iran, where I was born, with my family to Los Angeles, California when I was 4. And so I grew up in America, in a white and Western world and society. And I adapted so much more easily than my parents did because I was much younger. I was easily able to navigate the language. I was very fair skinned. And so I fit in a lot of different ways, especially after elementary school. Elementary school was kind of rough. But for most of my, young adolescence, I felt like there was one way that I was fitting in at school or with white friends, and then a whole nother way that my family was expecting of me. And so at home, there were different norms, different ways of doing things, different foods eaten, even. And I just remember all of those moments of feeling like I didn't make sense in either place. That at home, sometimes I didn't want this certain thing. I wanted something different. I wanted to wear Western clothing. I wanted to look like my friends did. And that wasn't okay. But then when I would go to school and eat my mom's pita sandwiches or the different stews from home, I also didn't feel like it fit there. And so I always felt like I was a little bit like never in each of those worlds. And I thought it was kind of mostly a me experience. I had other friends that were daughters of immigrants and Middle Eastern Swana women, but we didn't talk about those things very much. It was almost like we were going through it, but not talking about it. And then in college was, I think, the first time I began really learning about mental health, had my own experience with therapy, which was very new to me. And I really both loved it, but I also feel like some parts of it didn't fit. And so that began years long journey of trying to figure myself out as well as to learn more about mental health, to in some ways come back and serve my community. And then through all the years of doing the training and the hours and all of that, I talked to so many fellow daughters of immigrants and children of immigrants. And something really beautiful happened where even if I wasn't from their same culture, there were so many things that they were saying that I had felt, and so many patterns I started to see among them, even though they were from very different countries, very different religious backgrounds, very different skin tones, that I started to think, wait a second, this is a thing. This is a thing that people who are living in between cultures experience, and it deeply impacts their mental health. It deeply impacts the experience that they have. And so I just kept going with that curiosity about my own experiences as a multicultural woman, as well as supporting the daughters of immigrants. And in this realm, it was almost like what I learned at school was sometimes at odds with my own lived experience, what I knew from my own trying it with my family. And I started to almost break some of the rules and just do what I felt was right. Or say, well, with my immigrant family, I've tried this. And it started to really feel like it was working for the other children of immigrants. And that's where I think I started to gain confidence and also look at, wait a second, what is it that I'm learning? And what is the viewpoint that it's coming from? And so that's really what began my desire to continue figuring out what works for us as children of immigrants and how that might be different than what we're even taught about mental health or about supporting somebody therapeutically speaking. So now I'm a psychologist, but also a coach who works with people all over the world, and really supports to validate the experiences of children of immigrants and to have them recognize, like you did from the videos, of, oh, this is an experience and it's not just a singular me thing. It's an us thing. And maybe our specifics are different, but some of those feelings of not belonging, feeling torn, not feeling like they make full sense here nor there. It's like the Spanish, nada aquí, nada allá. Like there's so many different languages and expressions for that. I was even just reading something for my son, and there was a Portuguese word called saudade, And I guess it's like a longing for that which you might not have, like a longing for home
Nostalgia. Yeah.
or yeah, nostalgia. And so really the words might be different, the culture might be different, but I'm here to validate our experiences, illuminate our diverse stories, support us with tools that actually work for our cultures rather than against our cultures, and to break the stigma of mental health while also not totally taking on a Western viewpoint, because that doesn't fit for many of us. So that's kind of why I do what I do and how I do what I do. So here I am.
Wow. Thank you for doing that. I think there is so many of us who are in this experience, who live this experience, but where it's not talked about enough. We don't even talk about how we feel sometimes. So I think that something like this, you talking about it from a professional point of view, it's very important. And so thank you for doing that. And please keep sharing your insights because they're very, very precious. I was watching one of your videos, your recent videos, and you were mentioning the difference between the I and the we. So
Mhm.
the individualism versus the community. And I am a linguist, so sometimes I nerd out a little bit on languages, and I noticed that the only language that has a capitalized I, the pronoun I, is English, which is the par excellence the language of the West. And I don't think it's a coincidence because we use the Ge'ez alphabet. We have our own alphabet, which does not have capital letters. But if we capitalize letters, the capital one would be on the we, not on the I. So um, that really resonated with what you were saying because we are a culture that is based on community, and a lot of the issues that we born in the West find are related to this. But it's also a strength, something beautiful, I think. So one of the things that you mentioned is that difference between the I and the we, and what it translates to into the living experience of children of immigrants.
Yeah, this is such an important question. So individualism really, like you were saying, capital I, really thinks that the most important unit, the most important thing to consider is the individual person. And each person being unique, being different, being special, each person really being able to have a lot of personal freedom so that they can choose what is good for them. They can prioritize their goals, their wants, and their needs. This is seen as the most important. This is seen as the most healthy. And so, in an individualistic culture, if you care a lot about what other people think, that's seen as a very negative thing. That's seen like somehow you're not maybe excelling in the way that you could excel. You're not becoming the person that you're meant to be, which is independent, self reliant, and able to sustain themselves on their own. So, independence from their family might be really important. Um, Again, reaching their own goals and their own personal potential, that's going to be so important in an individualistic culture, which, for example, American culture is very individualistic. Some might even call it hyper individualistic. And then in collectivistic cultures, the unit that is most important is the collective, the group. You want to be similar to the group. So that's why what will people think is we don't want to be different from the group. We want harmony. We want to be connected to one another. So we is more important than I. And in collectivistic cultures, the group's goals are most important. So maybe that means I sacrifice some parts of what I want in order for the group to have what it needs. So the group could be your family, the group could be your church community, the group could be your local community. There are various units at play, but the group have to be considered, not just the individual. And the goal in collectivistic cultures is to have strong social bonds, which mean that there is a level of obligation and even responsibility that we have for our neighbor, for our loved one, And the goal is for us to support each other as a group, not just to think about our own individual goals. So somebody in this collectivistic culture that only thinks about themselves or their own goals, that would be seen as unhealthy. That person would be seen as disconnected from this beautiful network or this beautiful ecosystem that exists. Now, the hard thing can be for the children of immigrants is that you're kind of caught in between both of these worlds. And neither of them, just like I was saying in my own personal experience, neither of them feel like they totally fit, because you have absorbed, maybe growing up in a Western context, a little bit of individualism and how good it feels to be able to study what you want to study, or do the job that feels meaningful to you, or develop your own unique skills and talents. But also, you don't want to do it at the cost of your connections with your family members. And you want to find a way to almost feel like, is there a possible choice of having both? Do I have to choose? And so a lot of those clashes, what I call cultural clashes, come from when these things feel like polar extremes and it's either or, because neither of them are going to feel fulfilling. And the children of immigrants have this unique challenge, but also the unique strength of finding somewhere in the continuum. And it doesn't even have to be in the middle, but realizing these are not either or choices. These are continuums that you might be able to travel across and experiment with over your lifetime. And it's going to change. I know that since having children, I have been more focused on the connection to family, whereas maybe in my early 20s, I was more focused on my own pursuits in college, for example. So even in one lifetime, you might feel the pull, but it does feel confusing for a lot of children of immigrants to get very different messages from these two polar, what it seems like polar extremes, and to find what fits for them and how to preserve connection with family, which a lot of children of immigrants want to do, but also to take care of their own mental health or their own lives and their own wants and wishes and goals and pursuits. And so that's kind of the struggle and what I usually see, because there's things like feeling a lot of guilt, feeling a lot of shame, feeling really confused and lost, feeling a lot of pressure and expectation and not knowing how to handle some of those challenges. Those are some of the struggles that I hear time and time again from the children of immigrants who are really trying to figure themselves out in the midst of these very different cultural frameworks that are in some ways at odds with one another, but in some ways also both a part of your identity as a child of immigrant or a child of the diaspora.
Right. I growing up, I kind of resisted all this culture that I was surrounded with. But growing up, you tend to look inside and try to find more about your identity and who you are rather than fit in the group. And that was my experience. And I know that it's the experience of many that are from a different culture, that live in a different culture from the culture of origin. So even with the what I'm doing right now, I started Semi because I want to connect the children born away from their country of origin with their culture. Because me personally, I am a second generation immigrant. My parents came from Eritrea, and so the link was direct and it was strong. So I benefited from it. But my children are one generation detached. So I am not directly connected. And it's harder for me to pass on the values and the culture. So I started Semi to make this a little easier. And I started to focus on children. But I had so many requests of adults that actually wanted to access the services, the products that we offer. And so it became something broader. And I really feel that I always stress the importance of connecting to your culture um, to build self-confidence. I think they're directly connected. I've seen it even when I was a kid. I was a let's say I had a special experience because I was born in a time I was born in Italy. There was not a lot of Black people. So in my school, I was the only Black person, but I wasn't a minority like probably a lot of the children are right now, because there was no other Black person. So even the word minority, it it has a kind of a negative connotation. When you're in the minority, you feel less than the majority. And so I was the only one, so I felt special. I felt unique because everybody knew that Black kid, and it wasn't hard for me. Of course, there was, times where I had some comments, but they never made me feel different. Like thinking back, they had the same impact of a kid pushing you on the playground. Yeah, it's not fun, but who cares? And I think that comes from the fact that in the house, my parents were completely immersed in the culture. They showered us with it, and so I knew who I was.
Yeah.
How do we balance living between two cultures that are so different? And also, how do we make this a strength rather than a clash, something that is an obstacle?
Mhm.
How can we leverage this? I think it's a wealth, a special wealth that we have.
It absolutely is. And I think that knowing that you belong or have a sense of acceptance that goes beyond your current circumstances, knowing that you come from somewhere, come from a people, have a long history, have a richness of culture, these things are absolutely buffers to a sense of loneliness, a sense of not feeling like you're enough, and reclaiming that for ourselves is actually reconnecting us to a source that you were talking about, that you had as a child, of really feeling like you know who you are, have a grounded sense of who you are, even if that's not always going to be reflected back to you in the current environment. So it allows you to hold on to a truth about yourself that you don't need to always be mirrored back to you, because you have a much longer history that you can tap into, a much longer culture that you know roots you, so that when the wind comes like the tree, you're not just snapping off all of a sudden. So I think that children of immigrants have such that inner web and ecosystem of connection to not just a larger community, but to the past, to ancestors that you may never know. That can fill us with such a strength to handle what is going to feel at times like an obstacle. But maybe the reframe is, okay, what is this? What am I bringing to this challenge? And I think that children of immigrants have a few really special gifts at their disposal. And one of them is flexibility. To be an immigrant requires adaptability and flexibility. When things are not designed for you, you get very creative. And we call it, in my grandpa, his name was Varujan, last name is Agamalian, and we call it the Agamalian touch, because he was so creative with different things. And anytime we engineer something or create something very unique, we're like, oh, it's the Agamalian touch, from Varujan, because it's that immigrant ingenuity, immigrant innovation. So flexibility and innovation are strengths that come from needing to adapt, needing to adjust, and it not being designed for you. I see this also in the disabled community, is like when the whole world is built in a certain way, you get creative about how to move through that world. And I think about that for the children of immigrants, that when the Western world is not built for you, the challenge means that we come to it with flexibility and adaptability. And we also have the grounding of what our histories are and knowing where we come from. And that's a struggle for many people. They say, I don't really know. Or maybe I'm one generation removed, or my parents were afraid that I would have an accent, so we did not speak or did not learn the language that they spoke. That happens to so many. And I say, well, that's the beauty of living in a time where you can access these things for yourself. There are books, there are resources that now can reconnect you, even if you didn't get that during childhood. Speaking another language, or even if you don't speak the other language, having a different perspective also helps with something that psychologists call theory of mind, or mentalizing or cognitive flexibility. It just means that you're not just seeing from this point of view, you're seeing from that point of view. Like you were telling me, you don't think in English. I don't think in Armenian or in Persian. So I have the opposite. I have to, when I'm trying to speak those languages that are my mother tongue, but then I unlearned them and I had to relearn, I have to think about it. When you think like that, it's actually training and supporting your brain and getting stronger. So children that are bilingual or speak multiple languages have a lot of cognitive flexibility. They're more creative. They can, again, see things from a lot of different angles. And so I always say that our greatest struggle is our strength. So I don't think it has to be one or the other. It is going to be a struggle sometimes to figure out what feels right for you and to figure out how to honor your family and your culture and what maybe doesn't fit from your culture that you want to change. Maybe you want to do something different for yourself, different for your children. It is going to be a struggle, but that very struggle is your strength. It gives you that flexibility and adaptability. It gives you a different perspective. It gives you creativity and innovation to be able to try out something different and experiment with something different. Even think of fusion foods. I've known a lot of children of immigrants who are either artists or cook or create. And what do? They bring a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and they create something new that has never really been seen before because of some of those strengths that come from the struggle. And another piece I see is that there can be room for a lot of compassion. When you have known struggle, when you have struggled in a certain way, like on Monday of this week was actually, Monday of last week, excuse me, was actually National Immigrants Day. And I got a bunch of different books that I've been reading to my children, and my son has been learning about what an immigrant is. And many of these books have stories of children who are coming to a new place and they're missing home. Like one is a book called Saffron Ice Cream about this girl from Iran and she's missing her friend Azadeh. And he keeps going around the house like saying, oh yeah, I would miss my friends too. Like, Rasheen is missing Azadeh. Like he's really absorbing these characters and missing this. And in learning about these struggles, he's also learning about the strength that it takes to find beauty in a new place, to adapt to a new place, to be resilient, to experiment with a new language. And all of these things, even though he's not going to personally experience them, are part of his legacy, are part of his inheritance, I should say, things that can be his as strengths, but they come from acknowledging that at some point, struggle is also a part of that experience. So if you don't resist the struggle, you're going to be able to receive the strengths in some of this because we do have a lot of strengths. And at times it's going to feel like a lot to navigate. So one other thing I will say is the reason why I did, I put myself out there on Instagram. I wanted to create the community was because I knew how important it was when I had these discussions with other children of immigrants. And I wanted people to feel like they weren't alone in some of these struggles. And so if it feels too much of a struggle, one strength that you have is knowing you're not alone. What you do is so beautiful because you connect children of the diaspora so that even with all their differences, they can see themselves in another person's experience. And that community is such a strength for us to navigate through the challenges of life, whether it's this particular challenge or any challenge that comes up in our lives. So not forgetting that we've got that collective community support that we can lean on in other children of immigrants who can understand and relate to our experiences, even if they don't have a solution for us. It feels a little bit lighter when we can share and someone else says, oh my gosh, I've never put that into words. That's exactly how I have felt too. And every time I have one of those moments, it really gives me a gift. So the Instagram page is a love letter to other children of immigrants, but it's also a love letter to previous younger versions of me who maybe thought I had to navigate all of that alone, or I was navigating alone. Because each time someone says, oh, I've never seen that put into words, or I relate so much, or this gives me hope, or I don't feel alone, it like heals a part of me as well to remember our experiences really matter and our stories are important, and just sharing them actually makes us feel a little bit more hopeful. So our voice is also our strength. Our unique stories are also our strength. Our commonalities are also our strengths.
Right. Right. And since you're a therapist, mental health has been, especially right now, it's being talked about in our
Yeah.
community, which is uh, a new thing,
Mhm.
meaning that it has always been considered some sort of taboo, or rather, taking care of your mental health is not really. A lot of people might say that it's not a thing in our culture, but I think it is a thing. We just do it traditionally in a different way. So in the Western culture, taking care of your mental health might look like meditation, or taking a me day, going to a spa, or doing a massage, or taking time for yourself. But in our culture, living most of your day outside the home, it's a way of improving your well-being. And we used to do it, and now too, but especially traditionally, we were always out of the home. And that is really, when they say go out and get some fresh air, we do it constantly. And so that helps. We are very religious. So
Yeah.
spirituality, a connection to something bigger than yourself that puts everything into perspective, helps tremendously with, the challenges of life. And even the community itself, being always surrounded by loved ones, neighbors, family members, it really helps not feeling alone in the world, sharing everything. In the diaspora, I think we see it a lot during celebrations like weddings, or during mourning. A lot of people get together, and when you lose someone dear, one of the feelings you have generally is of being abandoned, of feeling lonely. But in a sense, I saw that in our community, people come to you, they cry with you, they eat with you, they sleep with you. Do you think that in some cultures, mental health is just not a priority, or taking care of your mental health is just different? It's approached in a different way.
Yeah, it's for me, absolutely, it's the second one. Mental health is approached in a different way. Another difference between Western and maybe more Eastern cultures is in Western culture, you have much more of a separation of mind, body, and spirit. And you also have a separation of like different parts of the body. Like you think of Western medicine, you have a heart doctor, and that's a cardiologist. You have a lung doctor, that's a pulmonologist. You have a gastrointestinal doctor, that's like a stomach doctor. Then you have a doctor that's ear, nose, and throat. So the body is like separated out into all of these different parts, and then you have a separate doctor for each of these various parts. That would be very, very odd in an Eastern culture where everything is dealt with in a more holistic way. There's no way to just think about the lungs because the lungs are connected to something else. And there's no way for you to just think about the stomach because the stomach is impacted by what you put in your body, which includes the heart. Everything is dealt with in a more holistic way. There is not a mind, body, spirit disconnection. There'd be so many times where I would say, oh, I have a stomach ache. And my grandma would say, oh, you've got like nerves. Or, oh, there's pressure on my chest, my dad would say. And they would say, oh, you're grieving or you miss home. So really recognizing that physical symptoms are part of your emotional and your mental and your spiritual well-being. It's all together. So I think in the West, mental health is talked about as this distinct category, that it's separate from your physical health, that it's separate from your financial health, that it's separate from your relational health and how your relationships are doing, because that's the way mental health looks in a much more fragmented and categorized. This is this category, that's this category, this is that category. Whereas all of this is together. And so, yes, I have heard from elders, oh, mental health doesn't exist. Absolutely, it exists because mental health is just your emotions, your thoughts, your actions, your well being. And it is deeply tied to your physical health, how your body is doing, and your spiritual health, meaning how your heart is doing, how your spirit is doing. And so in our cultures, maybe we haven't said mental health. And as a child of immigrants, I definitely remember hearing that for the first time, being like, what? that's a new thing. But when I thought about it, I actually did have some really important lessons, kind of like what you were saying, that my family showcased that now as a psychologist are so backed by research, and now they're almost common sense in the psychology world. Things like volunteering, supporting others, and altruism. When you give to others, it's a sense of belonging, it cuts down loneliness, it increases a sense of purpose. That's deeply tied to our cultures. And remember, the goal of the culture in a collectivistic culture is for the group to excel. So if somebody is sick and you feed them, you have done some part of your role in the group. So you feel purposeful. You feel like I have a purpose here. And I remember when my grandmother could no longer cook, she could no longer feed other people, she could no longer sew. That was really hard for her because she had lost a sense of purpose that was so integral to her mental health, to being able to feel a purpose. So I remember I would call her and I would ask her recipes or have her tell me stories so she could have some sense of a mental health boost by tapping into that altruistic, volunteer, giving part that is absolutely a part of our mental health today. And many times volunteering is suggested as something that can help you feel like more hopeful, less lonely, and to support. Another is deep tied to nature. My grandparents both were deeply tied to both nature as well as to plants and herbs and finding healing in nature, both in the beauty of nature as well as in the goodness of nature, whether it's a plant or a tea or an herb for a stomach ache or something in your body. And now we know being in nature and connecting with nature is very good for our mental health. You already mentioned also spirituality. So rather than maybe meditation, what about prayer? Prayer is like a meditation. Prayer is that moment of reflection. Prayer is connecting to something larger. Prayer is doing something with a lot of different feelings. So if you're worried, you pray. If you're feeling, afraid, you pray. If you're feeling confused, you pray. That is directly in psychology research now, taking feelings that are too much and doing something practical with your feeling. That helps with your mental health. But your grandma is not going to say it to you like that. She's going to say, we pray because God is important, or we pray because that's part of our culture. Another thing that you also mentioned around grief is routines and rituals. And those things, again, now we know from a lot of psychology research and new perspectives that when you have rituals, they're so grounding and calming. They're really great for stabilizing and reminding you, okay, I can do this because now you know this is how I make the coffee. And in this moment, all I'm doing is making this coffee, and then I'm pouring it, and then I'm sitting and I'm drinking it at these 3 times in the day, whatever it might be, maybe not coffee, but definitely tea. My family drinks tea around the clock. Those little rituals are such a powerful way of grounding us, connecting us to culture, maybe connecting us to community. You say in Armenian, like, like, come, let's have a tea. And around that ritual, you're gathering, you're talking to someone. Also, community support. Maybe someone from a purely collectivistic culture, maybe our parents or grandparents, would never go to a therapist. Like in Western, oh, you have a problem, go to a therapist. In here, it would say, oh, we should visit this person a lot. They're going through a lot. So maybe that person is getting a lot of visitors to ask them, how are you? Maybe the people are, like you said, practically showing up. When my mom died 16 years ago, there were women that would come that would iron my dad's clothes. Like that, I remember that years later because it touched me so much. He wasn't always in a place to talk, but they came to support him because they knew maybe as a man, he didn't quite know how to iron his own shirts. And so they came and they offered something that was very good for his mental health. He was getting that love and that support that was helping him feel like it was going to be okay in a really difficult time. But they were showing up in a very different way than saying, oh, Luke, you should go to therapy. That would be so odd. So in our cultures, absolutely there is mental health, but we don't see it as separate from all these other things. We see it deeply tied to our physical body. So my grandparents would never ask, are you happy? They would ask, do you have enough money? How are your studies going? Are you eating well? Are you sleeping well? These were questions that were asking about my mental health, but from a different perspective because they see mind, body, spirit as connected. They see my physical body as housing my emotions and impacting how I'm doing or not doing. And all of these things, whether it's giving to others, connecting with nature or plants and herbs, to cooking, spirituality, prayer, routines and rituals, these are all fantastic ways to take care of our mental health that are so deeply ingrained in our culture. So we do have mental health, and we also do have a lot of strengths from our culture that can help us support our mental health. It just requires seeing them from a different angle and saying, oh, of course, we didn't just create our own category for it. Of course, we don't see just the spa day. And maybe the spa day works for you now too. It's nice to try something different or new, but look at all these ways that are already in our culture to support us in our mental health. And that's a strength when you're able to kind of see the differences, but also see that that doesn't mean that our cultures don't care about how you're doing, how you're feeling. They absolutely do want well-being. They just define well-being a little bit differently than Western culture might.
Right. Connecting the dots makes so much sense,
Huge.
because it really didn't make much sense that in a culture so full with love and care for others, mental health is disregarded. It didn't make sense. So yeah, what you're saying definitely makes sense. And but there's also a part that is, in my opinion, something that should definitely be improved. That part of the culture that is negative, which is the stigma um, behind mental illness. So I was listening to this interesting podcast with this Eritrean psychologist that was saying that, especially back in the days, even right now, any type of mental illness was seen as something that you should hide. Even illness in general. If you have an ailment, when people ask you how you're doing, nobody would ever say, "I'm not doing well," even if they weren't doing well. It's always praise be to God. Whatever happens, we're always thankful, right? And we don't show the pain. So if mental illness is there, the person with mental illness might not be able to hide it. And so I heard during this podcast that hiding the person was a thing, keeping them in the house so others wouldn't see them. And that was also a way for the parents of that maybe child to care about the future of their other children, because mental illness was seen as something that was in the family, or something that was the result of a curse for someone that was superstitious of evil eye. And so the other children might not be seen as marriage material when they were in a age for marriage, because one of the other siblings was suffering from some sort of mental illness. And so all these things made me really realize how we are not understanding that sometimes it's chemical imbalance in your brain that might cause this. Sometimes it's something that could also be, absolutely fixable. Maybe it's depression, but it's seen as, I don't know what could be attributed to that. So coming from like such a background that is not the general experience maybe, but it's a lot of the experience of our parents, are the generation that we come from. And I also heard you say that generational trauma, it doesn't stop at the generation, but it continues. So maybe you could touch on that later on. But my question was, coming from such a culture, how do we normalize mental illness and not to be seen as something you can be ashamed of or a stigma?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're doing it right now. Every one of these conversations does it a little bit at a time. The fact that you were listening to a podcast by an Eritrean psychologist gives me so much hope, because I think we are slowly, with each of these conversations, beginning to normalize more and more and more, and to begin to take our mental health into our own hands. That middle of not Western and not maybe hiding somebody who is struggling and suffering and keeping them away from support. Maybe neither of these. Maybe we really validate, yeah, we are human. Of course we're going to have struggles. Struggles physically, We're going to have physical ailments. We're going to have mental and emotional ailments. We're going to have financial difficulties in our lives. We're going to have relationship difficulties in our lives. The more we talk about them, the more it's going to cut at the shame. Because anytime something is put into secrecy, it's going to create shame around it. And that shame just almost creates more and more and more shame. And we, as children of immigrants, beginning to talk about these things, just saying, I've experienced depression, or I'm taking medication for my anxiety, whatever somebody might say that is their experience, each of those conversations is beginning to change the culture. And truly, some of these things that exist in our culture are not things that would have existed in our culture had our cultures and previous generations not been faced with oppression, violence, slavery, subjugation, really to be going through civil war, right? And to be worried about survival. You don't hide someone who needs support if you're not worried about the survival of your family, for example. Why would marriage be so important? Maybe that was the only way that this family could pool together resources with another family to be able to make it. So maybe there was economic, financial difficulties that created such a situation. So when we look at some of these things that are really in our culture that can be seen as toxic or unhealthy or not matching the information we now have, we can bring some compassion and say, maybe at another point in time, this was helping our families survive in a different context against different challenges, but we don't have to continue that. Right now, we do have a lot of children of immigrants talking about mental health. Right now, we do have different doctors, whether medical doctors or psychologists, from collectivistic backgrounds, representing lots of diversity. It's not where it should be. Still a minority, as you were saying, and minority has that always negative, but representation matters, and more people are moving into these fields so that they can support with the language, the tools, and the collectivistic mindset so that they can bring mental health in a way that feels okay. And I've heard it described even within my family that was very religious of, look, God gives us physical doctors or medicines because he wants us to be well. This is just another way. You seeing somebody and supporting you through how you're feeling, that's another thing that God can support you with. And we will continue to pray for you, but it doesn't have to be at odds with these other ways that God maybe has a part in. And so I wouldn't explain that maybe to a client of mine if they were not religious, but this is one possible way that even in our cultures, we can create that change. And when we create those changes, we are breaking some of those cycles of abuse, cycles of unhealthiness, cycles of the survival tactics from years ago that maybe don't need to be brought into today, that are causing more suffering than they're helping us. Because being secret and silent and not getting the support you need around your mental health is why so many folks of color and so many people here, especially children of immigrants, their mental health is really being impacted, and we see that in numbers, right? So it's part of that shame and that secrecy. And the biggest thing that we can do is to continue talking about it, to speak our voices, to talk about our experiences, to use the tools in our cultures, but also to not be afraid of doing something different and to break those cycles. Because even if you get some pushback from your community, every single generation has done it a little bit differently than the previous generation. And it's okay to change. Culture is not a static thing that has to remain always the same. Culture is evolving and changing. And so we can lean into the flexibility and adaptability we talked about to say, is there another way to look at mental health? Is there another way that brings less shame, more freedom, more support? Is there a way that we can really bring more well-being, vitality, and support to our own communities? And when it comes from us, rather than outside from us, there is sometimes less resistance there because we are the community members. And so I want to encourage, if a child of diaspora is listening to some of this, is don't discount the power you have in your family unit, in your community, in your friend group, to be able to just say, yeah, I've struggled, or I've thought about seeking a therapist. I would like to find someone that understands our culture. Have you ever struggled with that? Even just opening up the topic can be such a strength. And it tells us that each time we do it, it's really hard to do it, but it's that much more powerful, which is why I always share my personal stories, not just here's what the book says, but I've lived it and I know that struggle. And it's so important for us to really talk about our stories because that is how culture change occurs, right? And our parents and our grandparents, they're listening. Even if they might not always agree, they're listening. And if someone goes and seeks treatment, support, and supports their mental health in that way, and they seem better, grandparents will notice, parents will notice. They maybe didn't agree from the beginning, but you taking actions towards supporting your own mental health with all of the cultural tools and other tools, your family and community are going to see that difference. And that might be one small, okay, maybe therapy is not always bad or always scary. That's how change happens in these small ways that then builds upon each other. And I always keep thinking of like, oh, culture is this thing that's passed on from the other generations. And then I have to remind myself, like, I'm 40. I have my own kids. Like, I'm I'm one of the leaders of culture now. Like, I don't have to
Right.
be 80 and 90. Those people will not be. I don't mean in a sad way, but they're not going to be around for the next 40 years. We, in this middle generation, 25 to 50, we are the cultural change makers. And so our stories, our discussions, I really want people to feel like they're not discounting it because there is so much power in just speaking about some of these things that are culturally taboo. And in each conversation, we minimize the shame and we minimize the secrecy of it. And we get better and better at thinking about what tools actually work for us. And I just have clients that say, I've actively now asked for a woman doctor or a Black woman doctor. And that for me feels really good and powerful that I have a choice now to go and ask for my doctor to be somewhat from a similar background or a woman of color, for example. That is one small, powerful change in beginning to change some of those cultural norms from within. So I hope that can be encouraging to someone, even while we have to acknowledge the pain when we hear stories like that, the suffering, the silence, the shame that happened for something that, like you said, could easily have been supported and the family could have had such a different experience. So I know that we can use that pain to create some of the change we want to see here and know that we're breaking those generational, cycles and doing it differently with our voices and the resources we now have.
Right. Thank you so much, Pauline. I'm very happy that I came across your page and I connected with you and you agreed to chat with me. I feel like your insights are really, really precious and they can change our perspective, even on how we see the negative or perceived negative parts of our culture and make us understand them more and be more compassionate and, think about their perspective and where they were coming from. So thank you very much. And if I want to add something that I remembered when I didn't want to interrupt you when you made the connection between prayer and meditation. So I used to do yoga, and during yoga you do a lot of and I ask questions all the time, even when you're not supposed to. And I asked my instructor, "What is this for? Like, is this part of the yoga? Like, it is not physical exercise?" And he mentioned that the vibration um gets your body warmed up and ready mentally and spiritually for the exercise. And I remembered one of the most practiced religion in Eritrea and Ethiopia, it's the Orthodox Tewahedo religion, and the service is very long. And it always begins with the priest chanting and saying this, oh, for I'm not saying hours, but almost. And a lot of people is like, okay, but when is the service going to begin? And the vibrations, the sounds elevates your spirit. It connects you to it connects the body and the spirit, right? So the only way to connect the spirit fast to your body is to hum deeply. And so that made so much sense. I was like, okay, they're getting ready to receive the word of God. So we might not know why we do certain things, but there's always a reason. That's what I always say. Nothing is a coincidence. So
Yeah, and even to add to that, humming and chanting is actually massaging the vocal cords and the muscles at the back of your throat, which are directly connected to the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in your body, and is one of the fastest ways to soothe your nervous system. So when you hum, it deeply soothes us. And scientists don't even know exactly why, but when we're in our mama's bellies, we can hear that vibration of her voice
Mhm.
inside. And so we came to the world with humming. It's why drumming or tapping is so soothing again to our nervous systems. And so many cultures also have drumming, tapping, or musical rituals around grief or celebration. Both usually, like wedding and a funeral, you
Mhm.
usually have some kind of drumming or some kind of rhythm or some kind of music, some kind of procession, some kind of chanting. All of that now we know is nervous system regulation. And then one last thing I will say is that the sound om, which is so common across so many different cultures, even if the chant or the sound might be a little bit different, that is actually the sound of, how do I make it simple? Like the sound of the universe. And when you have an
Mhm.
ecosystem, like there's scientists that go into an ecosystem and they have these sound tests and they test the sound of the ecosystem. When it's balanced, it sounds like, it sounds like that. When it's not balanced, for example, you have too many frogs and not enough of the animal that eats the frog. So that ecosystem is off. You hear it in the sound of that ecosystem. And so that tells me something too, because we are so deeply connected to nature that that sound is the sound of well-being versus sounds that really trigger for us we're not well or we're unsafe, and there's so many deep ways in which now psychologists, neurobiologists are just learning about these things. And like you said, we might not know why exactly, or science might not have the answers for us yet, but there's something in our bones that we know, maybe doing these practices, we've known, oh, yeah, of course, this is good for us. We might not know exactly why here, but we've known something about that chanting connects mind, body, spirit, something about that sound, and doing it collectively makes us feel like there's a sense of belonging. And I've had many times being in a drum circle or some kind of music procession where I've just been so moved by emotion in that moment because I feel so connected to other people. And that is something that maybe I don't have the exact science for, the exact answers, even though, like you, I'm always asking the question. But I feel like science is barely starting to catch up with things that have been in our, you know, cultures for thousands and thousands of years. And that's why it's about when we reclaim those things from our cultures, even without knowing the why, it's like Western medicine is like just slowly catching up to some of these things and telling us, oh my God, there's so many benefits that are into this. And that's why you can't ever just look at our cultures and say, oh, these are just backward, negative, toxic, unhealthy. There's so much beauty, so much richness. And of course, we have to change because change is a natural part of life. And also, we want to improve some of the things that are maybe not so helpful or not necessary anymore. And so I'm so thankful not just to meet you, but to hear about the work that you're doing. I think the connection that you're creating, the community that you're creating, I'm sure it's supporting and healing to you as somebody who's had these multicultural experiences, as a parent yourself, but also to the community that you're serving so that they can have the, oh, me too moment that creates such deep connection. And so, although our cultures are different, I felt so connected in the examples you were sharing, and just to get to meet you is a real treat and honor for me too.
Likewise. Thank you, Pauline.
You're so welcome.